Thank you very much for inviting me to AI Zurich. My apologies that I can't be there in person. My name is Josh Baumgardt. I'm a professor of computer science here at the University of Vermont. And what I wanted to do today is to talk about a particular application of artificial intelligence to a technology which has now become known as computer-designed organisms, or CDOs. This is work conducted both in my group with Sam Kriegman here at the University of Vermont and with our two biology colleagues at Tufts University in Massachusetts, Doug Blackiston and Michael Levin. What I'm going to show you today is an AI method we developed that is able to automatically design and optimize virtual organisms in physics-based simulation, and then transfer the blueprint of the best behaving virtual organism to our biology colleagues. They used a cell-based construction system to build up cell by cell a physical version of that virtual organism, and in that way realize a computer-designed organism. But before I talk about CDOs, I wanted to take a couple steps back, both in space and time. I did my PhD at the University of Zurich in the early 2000s in the lab of Rolf Pfeiffer. At that time, Professor Pfeiffer ran the AI lab at the University of Zurich. And during my PhD, as part of that process, we co-authored this book, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. So it was a book that describes the idea of embodied cognition. Basically put, the idea of embodied cognition is that the body is not an obstruction or impediment to intelligence, but instead the body is a facilitator. It is a tool that we use to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. And that feedback loop between us and the environment provides the raw data on which we can build up increasingly sophisticated and increasingly abstract cognition. There are many repercussions of the idea of embodied cognition, but probably the best example of embodied cognition is Steve Collins' passive dynamic walking machine. Here you can see Steve guiding his passive dynamic walker down a declined plane. This was work carried out in the early 2000s at Cornell University. You'll notice the passive dynamic walker is an extremely simple machine. It's so simple, in fact, that there are no sensors, no motors, no electronics, no neural network controller, no brain of any kind. The passive dynamic walker is actually a purely mechanical device. There are many lessons that can be drawn from the passive dynamic walker, but the one that's important for us today is that if you get the body right, if you design the structure of the body for a machine appropriately, it becomes easier to layer increasingly sophisticated intelligence or behaviors onto that machine. And that's work that I've been working on in my lab ever since I left Rolf Pfeiffer's lab at the University of Zurich. So today, what I'm going to show you are computer-designed organisms which, like the passive dynamic walkers, have no brains. What you're going to see in this video in the top half is a designed virtual organism, again acting in a physics engine. I'll talk more about the details in a moment. And as I mentioned before, our biology colleagues then built a physical version of this artificial organism down here, which has no nervous system and yet is able to walk along the bottom of its petri dish perfectly fine. Just to give you a sense of scale, here's a petri dish trapped under glass on the left here. As you can see, it's about the size of a grain of sand. It's about 1 millimeter across. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the process of how we create computer-designed organisms. There are basically two phases to this experiment. In the first phase, the AI is going to design the CDO, and in the second phase, we're going to actually construct one such CDO out of biological cells. To do this, we create a virtual world for our virtual organisms to inhabit. You can see this virtual world here. It's pretty simple, just an infinitely flat plane. And we then simulate our organisms as constructions of voxels or three-dimensional pixels. Inside this simulation, there are two types of simulated voxels. There are light blue voxels here, which are passive and soft. And over here we have red and green voxels, which are active. You can see that the active voxels are increasing and decreasing in volume, and they're pulling and pushing on the light blue passive voxels. Once we're able to simulate arbitrary constructions of these two types of voxels, we wrap an artificial intelligence method around it known as an evolutionary algorithm. That evolutionary algorithm at heart is a search process. It's going to perform a trial and error process. It's going to search over the space of all possible voxel constructions, searching for those that produce some desired behavior. In this case, the desired behavior that we supplied to the algorithm is that we want the algorithm to find a combination of voxels that will produce fast movement from the center position to the right. We're looking for something that is able to move itself. At the beginning of this evolutionary algorithm, it starts by creating a random combination of passive and active voxels. It comes up with this particular solution, and when the AI method simulates this particular combination of voxels, as you can see, it obtains a pretty low score. This particular virtual organism does not do a good job of moving from the center to the right. However, in this evolutionary algorithm, there is not just one candidate design, but there is a population of designs. Here is a second random design in the population at this time. As you can see, it has a different shape and a different distribution of passive and active voxels. You'll notice that there's a little bit more movement here. But again, this organism does not move very far away from its starting position. So this virtual organism is also assigned a very low score by the evolutionary algorithm. So this is a visual representation of how this evolutionary algorithm progresses. We have a population of random designs up here. As you saw, most of these designs don't move at all, but a few of them move 1 or a few millimeters away from the origin. We keep those slow-moving organisms. We delete the non-moving organisms and then make randomly modified copies of the surviving solutions. We simulate that new population of virtual organisms. We delete, again, the slower moving virtual organisms and make randomly modified copies of the remaining slightly faster moving organisms. And we repeat this evolutionary process for a number of days or weeks or months. In this particular experiment, it was conducted on our supercomputer here at the University of Vermont. We ran this process for several weeks. And at the end of this process, the evolutionary algorithm gave us back the best design that it had found over that period, which, as you can see here, is the following virtual organism. You'll notice that it does a pretty good job of moving from the left to the right. You'll notice it has a particular three-dimensional shape. That three-dimensional shape tends to bias the weight of the organism forward. There are active voxels that have evolved to lie on the underside of this organism, and passive material on the dorsal or the top side of this organism, and that tends to produce forward locomotion. As I mentioned, we then took this blueprint, passed it over to our biology colleagues. They then used not voxels, but used actual frog cells to build up a physical version of this design. I'm going to show you just a few details from how our biologists actually construct computer-designed organisms. If you'd like more details on the biological side of this process, you can check out our website. This process starts by harvesting cells from a particular frog, the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis. So our computer-designed organisms here have been nicknamed as xenobots for Xenopus. These cells are taken from very early frog embryo, and they are dissociated, meaning all the cells are pulled apart. You can see the individual cells, and they are then placed inside a small concave well, and in that well, over a period of several hours and days, the dissociated cells will gradually start to pull themselves together again, or re-aggregate. So we now have a clean mass of reassociated frog cells from frog embryo. Once they've reaggregated, Doug Blackiston, the microsurgeon on our team, is now looking through a microscope, and at the millimeter diameter here, he is reaching in with micro forceps and gradually scraping away from this original mass or sphere of cells. You'll see him reaching in here with forceps on the left and a micro-cauterization device on the right. This cauterization device has a heated wire and is able to burn away or otherwise remove some of the unwanted material. So this is basically Doug sculpting the three-dimensional form of this xenobot. You'll notice he's actually flipped the xenobot upside down in this case and is providing a cross mark scoring away of material. So he's sort of creating the little legs on the bottom or the ventral surface of this virtual organism. Once he's finished building this physical xenobot, he then takes it, turns it up right side up, and puts it in the bottom of a petri dish. And in some cases, as we report in the paper, the physical CDO walked along the bottom of the petri dish more or less in the same manner that the virtual organism walked along the bottom of its virtual petri dish. I want to talk a little bit more now about the voxels here that you see that make up this organism. You'll notice that we told the AI, or we told the evolutionary algorithm, that there were two different types of voxels, or two different types of Lego bricks that it could play with, the blue passive voxels and the red and green active voxels. This is because we actually used in the physical CDO two cell types: frog epithelial cells or skin cells, and frog heart muscle cells, which are the active part of the robot. Heart muscle tissue, if you rearrange it in a form other than an adult frog heart, the heart muscle tissue will not synchronize. Luckily for frogs and luckily for humans, if you put heart muscle tissue into the right configuration to make a frog or a human heart, frog heart muscle tissue and human heart muscle tissue will spontaneously synchronize and increase and decrease in volume to pump blood in and out of the heart. If that tissue is rearranged, as we've done in the xenobot here, we don't yet know how it synchronizes or whether it synchronizes. So in the simulation, wherever the evolutionary algorithm placed small amounts of heart muscle tissue, we told the AI to simulate these voxels increasing and decreasing in volume in random phase offsets with one another. So basically to not synchronize. This makes a very non-trivial design task for the evolutionary algorithm. It has to create an organism which has consistent or reliable behavior, which in this case is consistent forward travel, but it's building up this machine or this organism from unreliable parts. They act somewhat independently. Evolutionary algorithms are an AI method that have been around for many decades, and they're ideally suited for these sort of non-intuitive design problems. So what I just showed you is the evolution and behavior of an individual xenobot. We reported a number of additional experiments in our first paper on this a little over a year ago. One thing that we did was to construct multiple instances of that exact same xenobot you saw here, and release them as a swarm in the dish. We also simulated that up here. And you'll notice as you compare the simulation to reality here, if you place additional material in the virtual petri dish or the physical petri dish, the swarm of xenobots will unintentionally move material in their environment around. You'll notice also that due to the three-dimensional shape of these xenobots, they often collide with one another and temporarily form a bond just because of their 3D shape. And that allows them to perform the rudiments of collective action. As I mentioned, one of the goals of embodied cognition is to design the body of the machine appropriately so that it becomes easier to add on intelligence on top. In this case, it may be that certain swarms of xenobots become easier to layer on collective intelligence than other swarms. Here's a zoomed in version of an individual member of the swarm interacting with a small glass bead or pellet placed in its environment. You'll notice that the physical xenobot seems quote unquote interested in the bead at bottom. Although we didn't build these xenobots to have any nervous tissue or sense organs or coordinated muscle groups, these xenobots are made up of about 2,000 cells, and an individual biological cell is a sophisticated machine in and of its own right. It has its own suite of sensors and motors, so there may be some sensor-motor coordination or the rudiments of intelligent action that we get for free if we build robots out of biological cells than out of the traditional materials that we build robots like metals, electronics, and plastics. We've spent some time thinking about potential applications for this technology. One potential application is medical applications. At the moment, xenobots are made from frog tissue, but it may become possible in the not too distant future to build biobots out of human tissue. If we might be able to build biobots out of a human patient's own cells. And if they were to ingest that biobot, because it is in essence them, we might be able to design a biobot that avoids the human patient's immune response and is able to intelligently deliver drugs to various points in the body. The simulation here was actually, again, just evolved for locomotion. In this case, the evolutionary algorithm realized that a hollow xenobot is a little bit more hydrodynamic and faster moving than a non-hollow xenobot. And so in this case, we adapted this xenobot to a different purpose by putting this small yellow drug pellet inside the xenobot to demonstrate at least the potential of this technology for object transport and possibly in future applications, intelligent drug delivery. Another advantage of this particular approach to robotics is that as long as we run this evolutionary algorithm, because it's always maintaining a population of different solutions to the problem, here are 5 potential solutions you see here, we can basically use this evolutionary algorithm to continuously generate unique and novel solutions. This is particularly important in large-scale robotics where we might want to deploy large numbers of these small micro machines, either for medical applications or possibly for environmental applications. We could imagine deploying these xenobots into contaminated soils or waterways where they'd be able to collect microplastics or contaminants from the soil or these waterways. However, it may be that certain solutions that work well in simulation don't work so well in reality. However, if we design continuously novel solutions, even if some of them don't work, some of them will work. We refer to this as bespoke robotics. So bespoke in English means every single instance of the technology or the object is unique. You can see these different solutions to even just this simple task of forward locomotion. As we all know, biological populations that are a monoculture that all have exactly the same form and function, if something comes along to try and defeat or overcome that population, if they all rely on the same strategy, that monoculture is very vulnerable. So in thinking about robot swarms, it's useful to create not a monoculture, but in future to create heterocultures. You can compare that to, for example, Google's ARM Farm, an incredibly sophisticated technology. But again, all of these machines have exactly the same body, which means they're uniquely vulnerable to certain situations. And again, this highlights an important aspect of embodied cognition, is that we need to think carefully about the bodies of the machines that we're deploying. We would like to deploy bodies that are uniquely different and get the job done in different ways. So far, I've been talking about evolving virtual organisms and then building them from cells as physical organisms. This AI design system that we've developed, you can also point it to different physical substrates. In this case, physical soft robots. This is a physical robot built by our colleague, Rebecca Kramer-Botiglio at Yale University. Her and her students have built up voxels, hollow voxels made from silicone. You can supply an air source to these different voxels to expand or contract them and actually get something that deforms and moves, not that differently from what we see in simulation. If you're interested in the design and the AI and the simulation side of this work, please check out voxcraft.github.io/design. You can download and evolve your own virtual creatures. Here's more details about our computer-designed organisms, and you can visit voxcraft.github.io/build to find a kit of parts for building physical soft robots. So I'd now like to take a step back from computer-designed organisms and soft robots and situate this AI design method that I've described to you. I'd like to situate it in the larger landscape of AI and robotics to compare and contrast it to some more familiar AI methods like deep learning. In order to do this, I'm going to build up a geometric metaphor where we're going to start by assuming a one-dimensional line that represents performance. If we imagine any point on this line, we can imagine that point corresponding to a neural network or a robot trying to perform some task, like recognizing an object in a video or orchestrating movement. The further that point lies to the right, the better that neural network or that robot is at performing its assigned task. As we all know, for the majority of the history of AI, starting from just after the Second World War, most of the machines or computer programs we produced hugged the left-hand side of this axis. These were machines or algorithms that were very poor at recognizing objects and images or coordinating the movement of a robot. But thanks to the deep learning and the big data revolution, we can now automatically generate or train neural networks or machines that do as well, if not better than humans at certain tasks. If we think about neural networks and robots as points embedded in this one-dimensional plane, then line segments that are embedded in this one-dimensional line represent machine learning algorithms trying to push the points further to the right. As I mentioned, we can produce better than human performance machines on certain tasks, but not all tasks. And it's interesting to think about which tasks our current machines are good at and not so good at. So a way to think about that is to extend our one-dimensional metaphor here to a two-dimensional plane, where the vertical axis now represents the number of tasks that neural network or robot is good at. So now if we think about a point in this two-dimensional plane, the higher the point in this plane, the more general purpose it is, the more tasks it's trying to perform. And again, the further to the right this point lies, the better it is at that and all tasks below it. We can then think about future deep learning methods, more compute, more data, more experience. And for those of us that think artificial general intelligence or AGI may one day become possible, you can think about machine learning methods that are pushing along the diagonal. They are generating points along this diagonal where higher and further to the right points represent more general and more capable or more performant machines. For those of us that are working in robotics and computer-designed organisms and synthetic biology, we tend to think about a third dimension, which is embodiment. The term embodiment is controversial. It means different things to different people, but generally speaking, it means that we have a thinker that is housed inside an increasingly sophisticated body. So the approach that I've described to you today, this evolutionary algorithm, is a line that is pushing up and along the grand diagonal. This evolutionary algorithm is changing the body of these computer-designed organisms as the algorithm proceeds, and it is evolving increasingly sophisticated bodies for these computer-designed organisms. In future, this or related technologies might also be able to improve these computer-designed organisms or other evolved machines at the same time that it is making these machines more general purpose. I'd like to conclude here. I pointed out a few web links. Another resource you might want to check out is our newly created Institute for Computationally Designed Organisms, which you can find at icd.orgs.org. I'll conclude here. Please feel free to contact me. Again, my apologies, we couldn't do this in person. I wish you all the best with the rest of AI Zurich. Thank you very much.